beautiful thing that I've been able to do, like being here in Baltimore, is really highlight the way in which this city is like super duper segregated, hyper segregated, according to Douglas Massey at Princeton. And it's a Category 5 city, which is like, it's just like a hurricane. It's the worst. It's the worst. It's the most powerful, intense form of racial segregation. And I think even though we have a black mayor, even though we have a black police chief or police commissioner, even though we have a majority black city council, there's still the residue and really sort of the aftermath of Baltimore apartheid that lives on, that still exists in this city today, and it plays out in such powerful negative ways. Like, I'm just really beginning to get a sense that not only does it like boost racial bias, not only does racial segregation, set up this chase for resources because communities are redlined in our black butterfly where black residents live. But I really begin to think about like the dynamic of what happens when people have to chase those resources, when they have to chase grants, chase funding, chase dollars. Like, I really think that racial segregation in Baltimore set up a really nasty dynamic where black community members really have this infighting that takes place because you're trying to fight for finite numbers of dollars. And it's not finite because there's more money, it's because it's finite because our nonprofit industrial complex, our government, our large, predominantly white institutions, they put just so much in front of black communities in terms of funding. And black communities are at a frenzy oftentimes, to win, to be selected, to be awarded. You have to outshine these other black organizations. So I think it sets up a very unhealthy dynamic where we are like fighting each other instead of really sort of pushing for the control of the pie, as it were, overall, so that we can figure out a more equitable way to create racial equity in this city. And I think that's the story of what's happening. And it's not just racial segregation that creates that sort of infighting, but it's also forced displacement. When you uproot people, when you displace people, those social connections, those social bonds, the social networks, they're torn apart. And so literally we create more fragmentation with urban renewal, with highway construction through black neighborhoods, with the displacement of public housing residents through Hope 6 policies. Like, repeatedly, this city has uprooted black communities. We just visited Johns Hopkins, and the EBDI displacement, East Baltimore Development Initiative, displaced 730 black families. And so this constant sort of uprooting and displacing and pushing people over here and pushing people over there. It's like Grandmaster Flash said, don't push me, cause I'm close to the edge. And people are pushed to the, and that fragmenting of black communities, has led to this dynamic. It elevates the level of crime and violence, the dysfunction, and that sort of infighting in black communities. And so I begin to think of the way in which the black butterfly is being hampered and damaged at a very social level, not just statistical, numerical, quantitative, oh, here's what's happening with bank lending and dollars, but that sort of dynamic of what happens when a community can't solve its own problems. What happens when there are allegations of misconduct, but nobody trusts the police. Where do we go to address those type of issues? And I think that's actually playing out in Baltimore right now in very powerful and ugly ways. And so I think, I consider myself like a scholar of historical trauma and how ongoing historical trauma, as I frame it, this ongoing historical trauma, how that impacts black neighborhoods, how it impacts the health and the social dynamics. And Michelle Sotero, who utilized the original concept of a Native American scholar named Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart, Michelle Sotero developed a conceptual framework that sort of puts it all in focus for me. She says there are 4 components of historical trauma. You got segregation, forced displacement, you got physical/psychological violence, you got economic destruction, and you got cultural dispossession. And I just got through talking about just one of those categories: segregation and forced displacement. The way that those double hurricanes wreak havoc in black communities, not to mention the other three. And certainly we see elevated levels of violence. A lot of that, I believe, is very much connected to the issue of lead poisoning in many of our post-industrial cities, the ongoing crisis that we see in places like Flint, where they've declared a state of emergency. We need a state of emergency right here in Baltimore, Cleveland, St. Louis, these hyper-segregated cities that we see that also have elevated levels of violence. Chicago, they also have elevated levels of lead poisoning. And lead is this powerful neurotoxic toxin that doesn't belong in the human body, that elevates violence, and it inhibits people's ability to control their emotions. And so, I guess as a scholar, I'm particularly blessed to be, here at the mighty Morgan State University. Like, this school has a legacy of fighting and defeating racial segregation. To be where it is right now is a product of that fight. And it's a school that's over 150 years old now, coming out of the Civil War. Black Reconstruction, black people thought it was important to build an institution that could carry forth the vision of educating black youth and black young adults so that they can move ahead in the society. And so I consider myself a part of that legacy, a part of that tradition of being at this powerful institution that is a legacy, a part and parcel of black Reconstruction. And we're still here, we're still swinging 150 years later, and we're educating black youth, black young adults, and hopefully as Maryland's so-called premier urban research institution, we can create the type of science and the type of knowledge base that can really help make black neighborhoods matter.